to lead Asia and drag it forward, so to speak. And this was his constant effort in foreign policy early on. So he courted the leadership of China when the Great Bandung Conference, which gave rise to the non-aligned movement, took place in 1955. He felt it was his privilege and prerogative to introduce Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai around. The communist leaders weren't well known and were still supporting violent insurrection all over the world, so they weren't particularly welcome everywhere, but Nehru made himself the champion of the Chinese regime. I think he, in fact, in reading him, one knows that he thought all of this was warmly appreciated in Beijing. In fact, it wasn't. Zhou Enlai detested Nehru, but was very reserved, and so didn't show it. Indeed, a few years later, he said to a group of Western journalists of Nehru, "I have never met a more arrogant man." And so the seeds of the rivalry, the political rivalry in Asia between India and China, which is a fact of life today, were probably present back then, beginning to germinate, and have since taken many forms. In 1950, the Chinese invaded Tibet. If you look at a map of India, you'll notice that Tibet overhangs all of the north of India. And contrary to our intuition, the east-west axis of North India is nearly as long as the north-south axis we tend to think of as the principal feature of Indian geography. So virtually all of the north of India is overhung by Tibet. So having the Chinese invade Tibet was a very meaningful experience for India. And for the Chinese invading Tibet, having India just to the south was not exactly reassuring either. Why? In an event Western history doesn't record, but that's very important for the Asians. The Qing dynasty invaded Tibet in about 1911. And the then Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama, fled Tibet and settled in India. 3 years later, he returned triumphant to Tibet. How did that happen? The Qing dynasty had collapsed as a result of all sorts of machinations in the heartland of China. So for the Indians, having the Chinese right on top of them wasn't exactly reassuring, but for the Chinese, having the Indians just to the south wasn't either, because they remembered very vividly their episode from their history in which a Dalai Lama had reconquered, so to speak, Tibet by default at a moment of Chinese weakness. The Dalai Lama, the current one, the one we often see on TV, the very endearing figure, who was still a very young man at the time, held on for the first 9 years of Chinese occupation, hoping things would get better. But in 1959, he fled Tibet for India. And he's been living in India ever since. A fact that the Chinese government finds nearly unbearable. He lives in the foothills of the Himalayas, and although he hasn't overtly done anything to aggravate the Chinese, his mere presence in India is a provocation to their view that Tibet is an integral part of China. Not long after these events, India and China fought a border war because the border was disputed. The British had mapped out some of the border, but not other parts of the border. The Chinese claimed a significant part or a significant territory controlled by the Indians in 1962, and the Indians claimed quite a large chunk of territory in India on the border of India's northwest, which the Chinese controlled. India wasn't anticipating China's attack at all, even though India had been quite rude towards China for quite a while. I don't know what Nehru thought he was doing in declaring a forward policy and sending all sorts of troops up to the border, ill-equipped troops, and troops that were no match for the Chinese when the war came. But the Chinese attacked in October 1962, comprehensively routed the Indian army, took control of most of the territory, in fact all of the territory they claimed, and a month later declared a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew from all of that territory unilaterally. The humiliation for Nehru was huge. He never got over it. He died two years later. It was the low point of his life story. And it was the beginning of another element that's quite important in the Indian psyche, this sense that India is not just threatened in the abstract by China, but the memory of India actually being defeated militarily in an unambiguous way in 1962. Now, Nehru was a man who is interpreted by most historians as an idealist. And I think in many ways he was idealistic, not in the way that Gandhi was, but his vision for India, for the world, was a very generous one. His vision of international relations was defined by his perception that India couldn't afford to get involved in the Cold War and needed to remain entirely independent from that dominant feature of international relations at the time. So the non-aligned movement was helpful to India, and that worked fairly well as long as Nehru was alive. India was assisted greatly by the West in the 1950s, particularly with food aid, but also in some other areas, including aspects of industrialization. But by 1964, when Nehru died, the Indian economy, it was clear, hadn't taken off in the way he wanted it to, and India was more dependent on foreign assistance than any Indian prime minister could be comfortable with. As well, Pakistan had grown economically more strongly than India had in the intervening decades, and Pakistan was in a position to, if it chose, even though it's a much smaller country, threaten India's security, which it did in 1965 by attacking India. The fragility of the economy, the vulnerability of Indian security, Chinese in 62, Pakistanis in 1965, made Nehru's daughter, who became prime minister after a 2-year interregnum under someone else, Indira Gandhi, much more of a hard realist than her father had been. And she said fairly early on that the world didn't lend itself to sentimentality, that India would have to make its way as best it could, relying on itself, and any countries willing to be good friends to India. In practice, this meant the Russians. And so in 1971, just before India and Pakistan engaged in another war, India allied itself with the Soviet Union. Nehru had instituted a system of fairly soft socialism in India as the dominant economic and social model. It hardened under Indira Gandhi into a sort of harder version of socialism, which did even more damage to the economy than Nehru's soft version did. such that as the years went on, India's economy became more and more fragile rather than less and less fragile, because socialism really wasn't a model well adapted to either the Indian mindset or to India's needs. In 1974, India tested a nuclear device, purporting it to be a peaceful nuclear test. In the West, most people assumed this related to India's antagonism with Pakistan. In fact, of course, it was an answer to China's first nuclear test in 1964, because for India it was insupportable not to be in a state of nuclear parity with China. Pakistan has never threatened India existentially. China could. So this struggle for parity with China was vital. But it caused India to be isolated internationally. The United States in particular worked hard to isolate India on the grounds that nuclear proliferation was the greatest risk facing humankind, and that India had committed the unpardonable sin of proliferating. India's economy went on weakening, such that by the time that Indira Gandhi's son Rajiv had been Prime Minister 5 years, Indira Gandhi having been assassinated in 1984, the economy was just in terrible shape. The country was heavily indebted, and by 1990 it was a basket case. And this actually turned out to be terrific for India, because it forced on India, in a crisis, a balance of payments crisis, India was bankrupt, it couldn't pay its international bills. It forced India, against the judgment of most citizens, and certainly against the judgment of the political establishment, to introduce economic reforms that not sweepingly liberalized the economy, but somewhat liberalized the economy of India, starting in 1991. The man who is currently India's Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, was then the Finance Minister of India, and so these reforms are very much associated with him. The rate of growth in India had started rising during the late 70s and 80s, but after these reforms, it accelerated very sharply, and eventually resulted in the Indian growth story that our newspapers are pleased to write about non-stop, and that makes India attractive to Canadian business and makes India stand out in the world today. All of that only resulted from these many decades of economic mismanagement in India, followed by a sharp crisis. During these years, Canada and India were estranged. And one of the reasons that many of us who are of a certain age, as the French say, have India out of focus during the 70s and 80s is that the two countries were barely dealing with each other. Canada was very offended by India's nuclear test. It was part of our idealism that the non-proliferation regime was in part our baby, and Canadians felt strongly about that because we could have developed a nuclear weapon in 1945 in no time flat, having been part of the Manhattan Project, but renounced it in the service of the greater good of humanity. So India's test was very negatively perceived here, and in 1984 events took place in Canada relating to fringe elements of our own Punjabi community that threatened the integrity of India, financial and other support from within Canada for a separatist movement in the Punjab in India, which was in Delhi like a dagger pointed at the heart of the Indian Union.